Hello again, and welcome to the latest video in our review of all the additional factions you can get through mods in Gates of Hell Ostfront. Today we're going to be reviewing the Czech and Czechoslovak armies that are available through the Czechoslovakia At War mod. So this is separate from the Valor mod that we've been normally reviewing. Don't worry, we're going to get back to that. But this is a pretty neat mod, actually. Now, it does have some compatibility issues, so make sure you are running as close to the original game as possible. You might have to do a little bit of finicking on your side to get it to work, but it is a pretty good mod, and it does provide you with a few new versions of the Czech forces in the Second World War, which are both Axis and Allies. So you get the first Czechoslovak Army Corps in the USSR, first Czechoslovak Independent Armored Brigade, Slovakia, and Czechoslovakia. So today we're going to be starting with the first Czechoslovak Army Corps in the USSR. So before we start, thank you to everyone who has liked and subscribed, and if you haven't done so, please do. I do appreciate it. So this force, you'll notice that with most of the Czech forces, they are a little under-resourced, which, essentially as an auxiliary to the Red Army is essentially what they became. They were not top priority for resources. However, you do get a bit of a different structure to the research tree, which gives you obviously an officer to start off with, and then you do have your stages, your support, and your defenses. So it's essentially the same structure, but what's the difference is you have to actually research all these at the top before you can access them below. So it's a little more restrictive, but to be honest, for a force that is a little more under-resourced, it does give you a little bit more of a struggle to actually build up, and you do have a lot more limitations early on in the game, and you kind of have to find workarounds for things. So it does work out. But starting on the infantry, so the first unit, the officer. Now, I just want to comment before we start on the modeling that's been done in this. It does look fantastic. I do appreciate this is a community built mod, so it's not necessarily up to the spec for the regular game, but it does have a lot of work that's gone into it, so it does look quite good. So the first drill unit, we have the partisans. You get 5 riflemen and 4 submachine gunners. See him here, he's got his sort of trench coat on and a captured German helmet with the PPSH. And then, interesting, the riflemen have the German Mauser. So, honestly, not a bad unit. They are quite lightly equipped, as you would expect. And a good idea with these guys is to honestly loot the enemy bodies and take as much as you can. It does really help out, especially if you can get a machine gun in there, but they are actually surprisingly hard hitting, especially if you can get close with those submachine guns. Good for the early game, pretty cheap, so do recommend them. They're a great way to sort of get in there and bulk up your force as well later on with some cheap units, and if you do accumulate the experience, they're not bad. And then the first you have the recruit squad, which you'll notice are actually wearing the British BD. Now, I believe this was probably associated with a lot of the units that were essentially supplied by the Western Allies through sort of the Iran Lend-Lease corridor, sort of middle of the war. Now, they do have the British BD mixed with the Soviet weapons, which is an interesting look for sure. But it does give you a, reasonably good close quarters unit with basically 4 riflemen, and the rest are armed with submachine guns. So they're, reasonably hard hitting at close range, though you are lacking anti-tank capability, and you are lacking any sort of support weapon like a light machine gun. So you will want to upgrade them, but they are, they're solid enough. You have the Insurgent Army Squad wearing the older Czech uniforms, like how the section commander has the peaked cap on, marking him out as a nice target for snipers. But they do have the fairly okay modeled Czech uniform. So this gives you essentially a squad of riflemen with a machine gunner who does have the VZ-26. So just for your reference, this is essentially the weapon that that the British based the Bren gun off of. So the Bren was essentially an evolution of this, and it was a fantastic light machine gun. Definitely one of the best of the war. It would be used by the Czech army. Pre-war, the Germans actually used quite a lot of them. Contrary to what you may believe, the Germans did really use quite a lot of captured equipment, and it was necessary for them. But you do get that in this section. But otherwise, there are no submachine guns, and they don't have that much in the way of anti-tank capabilities. So they are quite lightly equipped, but they're okay. Then you get a regular squad back to the Lend-Lease provided BD, and here you have a little better weapons. You have the SVT-40, so a semi-automatic Soviet rifle. And for the machine gun, you have the DP-27. So all Soviet weapons. Essentially, it's the same section as before, but with one less submachine gun and the addition of the squad's light machine gun, which is honestly, I think, a great upgrade. So standard, normal infantry, nothing too special. You have a veteran squad. They're now, really showing some of the later war units that were essentially integrated into the Red Army. They were essentially just a component of it at this point. And this is really the forces that would fight with the Red Army through a lot of Eastern Europe, eventually helping to liberate their own country. But were also kind of used as cannon fodder essentially by the Red Army. So here in the Red Army uniform, we have essentially a squad of half submachine guns, half rifles, with the addition of the DP-27. So essentially the same as the regular squad. Then you have the shock infantry wearing that Soviet camo coverall, and they're pretty much same with a light machine gun as well. So you are going to get a lot more anti-tank weapons and a lot more, capability in a unit like this. So they're definitely more elite. To be honest, though, I would spend the points elsewhere, get into good vehicles, get into artillery, as we'll talk about later. But, if you can get the experience built up in your regular veteran squad, you'll probably do better. Paratroopers, which are essentially just wearing the normal Red Army uniform. To be honest, most Red Army paratroopers at this point in the war were paratroopers in name only, though you do notice they have the PPS-43, which is essentially the mid-late war production of the Soviet submachine gun, so it was an evolution on the PPS-H, and you'll see that equipping a lot of Red Army units later in the war, so it's interesting that they have those. But a pretty submachine gun heavy unit, a bunch of rifles, and you do also have a anti-tank rifle in addition to the squad's light machine gun. So a little harder hitting unit. The anti-tank rifle is going to be decent against armored cars, certainly soft skins, and some of the early war vehicles. It's useful, but it's not, not necessarily great. So they're fine. So moving on to support weapons. Anti-tank detachment. So this is with the Soviet PTRD-41 anti-tank rifle, one of the more effective anti-tank rifles of the war, giving you 36 millimeters penetration at 100 meters. So a few of them can do some damage to lighter tanks, can definitely cripple them, but you're not going to want to rely on this. Definitely get some anti-tank, better anti-tank weapons in there, but it's fine. Medic, yep, it's a medic. Anti-personnel miners, so if you watch any of my other videos, miners and engineers are great for defensive scenarios, almost useless in offensive, but they are going to be great for those sort of choke points, so good unit. Anti-tank miners, prefer them over the anti-personnel miners, but pretty useful. Can use them as essentially second line infantry as well. Field engineers, a little more useful in the assault. They do have mine detectors, so if you do encounter a minefield, you can clear that, or at least locate it, and absolutely critical in defense for digging in. Tank crew, yeah, it's a tank crew. Good for recrewing your tanks if they've taken casualties or capturing enemy vehicles, and they do have a better repair stat, so good to capture enemy equipment, which honestly with this force you will be relying on captured enemy equipment. I do recommend it. Sniper, yeah, it's a sniper, you know what that is. Ammo crate, good for resupplying your infantry, and this unit actually does let you, as far as I'm aware, resupply heavy weapons, which is kind of neat. A lot of the other forces, especially through the Valor mod, not this part of the Valor mod, do distinguish between infantry and heavy weapons supply. Maxim 1910, so basically the Soviet machine gun, does have the gun shield, which is actually pretty useful. It's good because one man can move it around because it is on this handy dandy little cart. And yeah, it's good machine gun. 37 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. Now that we're into more the proper artillery, this is a good heavy autocannon. With your armor piercing, you do get 62 millimeters at 100 meters, and with the rapid fire, you will be able to do some damage actually against some lighter medium tanks and definitely light tanks, so good to use. Kind of a pain in the ass to get it anywhere, so you're going to want to tow it, but it's okay for ground support. Definitely good if you're expecting air attack as well, which occasionally the AI does actually bring, and if you're fighting against a human opponent, then maybe you should expect it. 45 millimeter M42 anti-tank gun, so 54 millimeters at 100 meters, not bad. You'll notice this is the longer barreled version with the spoked wheels, which is interesting little distinction. I don't know if Soviet forces have that. Might be kind of an indicator that maybe they're supplied with some older equipment. I don't know. Yeah, it's good, especially early on, because you do have very limited access to anti-tank weapons with this force, so do recommend taking it. Reasonably cheap, great on the defense as well if you can sort of dig them in and use a few of them to sort of tag team enemy armor. 76 millimeter ZIS 3, so a good multi-purpose gun. It does have a pretty good high explosive shell, reasonable range, and it does give you 74 millimeters at 100 meters, so not the best anti-tank gun, but very capable nonetheless, and definitely great in defense. You could bring it in the offense, sort of park it there and fire high explosive at your enemy, but honestly, I don't really recommend it as much. It's good in the defense, though, especially as you're going to have to rely on anti-tank guns a lot more with this force. Moving on to maybe artillery proper, and a 82 millimeter BM37 mortar. Again, I have mixed results with mortars, but with this force, I actually did end up using mortars a lot more just because you don't have access to artillery quite in the same way. Notice that they are at the end of the research tree, so you will be having to rely on captured enemy equipment quite a lot more with this force, so just keep that in mind. Pretty useful actually, and you really do kind of appreciate that little bit of indirect fire that they do provide, even if it is kind of inaccurate. Park an ammo crate next to it and it will keep it supplied a lot longer. 122 millimeter M30 Soviet howitzer, very good gun, decent range, but it is harder to get with this force. You do really feel that resource deficiency, but if you can get it, then it's fantastic. I'm a very artillery heavy player, partially why I never show my actual playthrough videos, because they're really quite boring. But if you can get this, it's a great gun. Definitely recommend it, and it's kind of the only true artillery piece that this force can get. Transport, decent for towing, good to move your infantry if you want, but I don't really recommend it unless you need to steal enemy weapons. But if you can, upgrade to the supply truck. It can resupply all your units. If you park it near artillery, you'll essentially have unlimited ammo for them. And it's good for towing as well. So tow an artillery piece with this, park it next to it, and you'll be able to sustain your fire. Engineer truck, pretty good because you can resupply your engineers' build points, but the issue is in most defensive battles, you don't have enough time to really use up all your engineers' build points by the time you actually get them into position. So I honestly don't think it's really worth it. Let me know if you use these and find them useful. BA-64B, I had to kind of beetle around in this, especially early in the game. A little more than I normally use a armored car. It's extremely lightly armored, so you're vulnerable to pretty much anything other than small arms with this. But it's fast, it's maneuverable, and it does give you a bit of a mechanized capacity, which is quite lacking in this force. The machine gun on it isn't really the greatest. I'm not a huge fan of the DT machine guns. I think it's probably one of the worst armor machine guns in the game, in my own opinion. But it is what it is, and you don't really have that much of a choice with this force. So use it. If you can get around sort of your enemy, get into their rear, it can be quite useful to go after artillery, things like that. And its mobility, maybe you have a chance of actually staying away from getting hit. Otherwise, it's really quite vulnerable, so careful with it. But it is one of the few armored cars or armored vehicles that you do have access to, so, use it. Now we're into actual tanks. The T-70, so reasonable light tank. You do have up to 35 millimeters of armor, and the 45 millimeter gun does give you 45 millimeters of penetration at 100 meters, so not bad early on. You might have to use this a little more than you'd otherwise like to, but that's kind of part of the challenge of this force. It really is challenging to play as the Czech forces in the Soviet Union, so do capture enemy equipment, but this is a decent little tank. It's pretty mobile. Yeah, it's good. You'll want to support it with infantry though, and it is quite vulnerable, but it's what it is. Now, you do jump quite a lot right into the T-34, the 1943 version, which in my opinion, other than the T-34-85, is actually the best version. So at this point, you have the larger turret. So one of the main issues with the T-34, with the 76 millimeter gun, is, other than being mechanically quite brutal to operate, extremely low quality build, often missing a lot of components, which honestly can be definitely excused. It was a wartime production vehicle. They did have to cut some corners just to get something out into the field, but they suffered terribly. Losses in Soviet tank crews were absolutely catastrophic. But one of the main issues with the early productions, with sort of the smaller turret, is the ergonomics inside were so terrible that it really slowed down the reload speed on the gun, just because it was so cramped. By 1943, with the revised turret, they were able to actually speed that up. They added another crew member. Okay, so next vehicle, the T-34, which is the 1943 version. So in my opinion, probably the best T-34. One of the big issues of T-34s, especially early in the war, was the absolutely terrible ergonomics inside. Out in the sort of pretty rough build quality, missing some critical components, and the lack of training. I won't get too much into it, but the T-34 was kind of been an overhyped vehicle, to be honest, in my opinion. But one of the big issues was the ergonomics in the vehicle, and you'll notice with the smaller turret, especially in this game, the reload speed on the gun is weirdly long, and that's essentially because the ergonomics inside were so awful, it was so cramped that the gunners actually had a hard time loading it. They had a hard time targeting, terrible situational awareness. By 1943, with the larger turret, they did improve that to some degree. So you still get the excellent 76 millimeter gun which gives you 74 millimeters at 100 meters. Not bad. And it does have a faster reload speed. It's quite maneuverable. Yeah, very good tank, pretty good armor, up to 100 millimeters. Do beware the side shots, but to be honest, this one you can access actually quite early, and you don't have that many choices, so there's not many places to actually spend your points, so you will have access to it maybe earlier than if you were playing the Soviets, actually. So fantastic tank to use. Definitely recommend it. Do support it with infantry, though. It can get side shotted and taken out, but that's really like any vehicle. So fantastic tank for sure that they do have access to. And then the same vehicle, Zizka. So after the medieval Czech sort of national hero Jan Zizka, so interesting, characterful vehicle, kind of fun. And then the next evolution, the T-34-85 with the national marking on the side, which is pretty cool. And this, like the other one, it's a pretty good all-around tank. It does give you a good hull machine gun and coaxial. And then you have an additional crew member to crew that 85 millimeter gun, which is really quite an effective weapon. So it gives you 116 millimeters penetration at 100 meters. So you'll be able to deal with really most things you'll come up against. So definitely good vehicle. And then you have the KPUV. I'm gonna have a hard time here. Napasoch. We'll go with that. Yeah, apologies for the pronunciation. So essentially the German Marder built on the Skoda. The Czechs did actually receive a few of these. So essentially the Axis allied Czech forces late in the war received, I believe, 2 of them for armored training from the Germans. They sort of were there late in the war, but they actually only saw action against the German forces. They did, I think, knock out a few Panzer IVs, but unfortunately the sort of uprising they took part in was anticipated by the Germans, so they were knocked out shortly after. So there were 2 of them in service with the Czechs, I believe. Both of them were knocked out, and they were used against the Germans late in the war. So an interesting little vehicle. Pretty good. You do have the 75 millimeter Pak 40, 133 millimeters of penetration at 100 meters. So really effective, high velocity anti-tank gun. Quite lightly armored, but it does give you a hull machine gun as well. So, reasonable vehicle. And finally, the Su-85. So the, Soviet tank destroyer. You'll notice it doesn't have a coaxial machine gun, so you're going to need to support this guy with infantry, but it does give you that excellent 85 millimeter high velocity gun on the T-34-85. So pretty good as an anti-tank weapon, pretty good tank destroyer, but you're going to need to support it with infantry if you are using it in the offensive. And it does have pretty good armor, so up to 100 millimeters. So that brings us to the end of the Czech forces in the USSR. Overall, a pretty challenging force, actually, with limited options. You do have some good choices later in the game, but it is going to be a bit of a struggle, and you're going to have to be a little more crafty with them. I found myself having to really rely on captured equipment, having to really rely on infantry a lot more than I normally do, and sort of being a little more sneaky and creative with how I fought it, not having access to artillery in the same way. So definitely a challenging force, and I do recommend it. So check out the mod, and like and subscribe. It does help out the channel. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.